No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. So begins a poem called Home by Warsan Shire, a British writer born to Somali parents in Kenya. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than the journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. Shire's poem goes on. I will break off to say, Elimelech and Naomi did not leave home because they wanted to. The desperation described in Shire's poem reflects the desperation these ancient figures must have felt. Though they weren't fleeing war, they were hungry. There was a famine in their homeland, so they were hungry. Their children were hungry. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one walks toward the territory of Moab. That's how people would have said it, freaking Moab. It was a place they believed to be hostile, even God-forsaken. No one takes their children to Moab unless home will not let them stay, and they have nowhere else to go. There was no wall to prevent them, no soldiers to separate children from their parents at the border, no cages to detain, no laws to prohibit them. Maybe Moab wasn't that bad, after all. Elimelech and Naomi and their sons settled down. They began to make a life in Moab. But as too often happens when trouble chases a family from their home, this family's struggle seems to follow them. Elimelech dies. Now it's just Naomi and her sons. Both men marry. They marry Moabite women. And things continue for 10 years, 10 childless years, which is surprising in this context and probably points to a different sort of struggle. Then the two sons unexpectedly die. And here the Bible's lens comes to focus on Naomi. She is all we see, an aging woman without her children, without her husband, seemingly alone. Naomi was not alone. We'll hear more about her daughters-in-law soon. But the way the camera zooms in on Naomi reminds me of something Nicholas Wolterstorff said in his book, Lament for a Son. He said that grief isolates. It was important for Wolterstorff to realize that after his own son, Eric, had died, because Wolterstorff's grief isolated him, not only from people who were happy, but even from members of his own family who were also grieving. That's because they were all grieving differently. Each person's loss had its own unique character, as each person's relationship with Eric had had its own unique character. The dynamics of their sorrow were different too, more intense one day, less intense another, hardly ever in sync. This is how Naomi was alone in her grief, without her two children, without her husband. No one understood exactly what that was like. Naomi was alone, but she wasn't alone. And one thing that is striking about this story is the way the three women grieve together, the space they give to their lament. Pastor and Professor Marilyn Pagan Banks drew my attention to that. She observed that we don't often allow ourselves the chance to truly lament, not as the church and certainly not as a society. We've gotten really good at moving on, she said, at figuring out what to do next, creating lists, making arrangements. We are not so good at lamenting. But some powerful grief is expressed by the women in this story. And though the story moved quickly as it mentioned the moments of death and loss, the story lingers upon the women's expressions of grief, how they weep and will not be silenced. Pagan Banks wondered why. She wondered if Orpah and Ruth's tears gave Naomi permission to say out loud what she'd been feeling deep inside, that the hand of God had turned against her. It can be hard to admit something like that. Maybe Naomi's lament set Orpah free to return to her mother, to do what was best for herself in that moment. The Bible does not judge Orpah, nor should we. Maybe Naomi's tears were what drew Ruth all the closer. Perhaps as she wept with Naomi, Ruth came to understand where her deepest loyalties lay. To share grief can be powerful for people. It can be exactly what we need. But it's hard, isn't it? Even just to sit with folks in their grief, it is really hard. Kate Bowler, who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of 35, has written about this. How when something terrible happens, we rush in with explanations and reassurance. She believes that one of the main reasons we do this is that we want to believe life is durable. We want to think that if we live carefully and well, we can avoid danger, we can avoid illness, we can avoid heartache. We live with what Kate Bowler calls a thick cultural script around positivity. There are religious aspects to that script, like the idea that it's all part of God's plan, and God won't give you anything you can't handle. There's also just the popular notion that today may be hard, but tomorrow will be better. That if you work hard and have the right attitude, you will rise to the top. Those notions are compelling, Bowler says, especially for those of us who are trying to find agency in our lives, or if no one has ever told you to believe in yourself, to hear that the best is yet to come, it's compelling. But these notions can be inadvertently cruel, like for people who are living with chronic illness, or for folks who can't live their best lives now because they're caring for somebody else, aging parents, sick and disabled children. Or for people like Naomi, whose home has chased them away, whose loved ones have died, whose lives have unraveled. Bowler says, I think our culture makes us feel really embarrassed for the terrible things that happen to us. It makes us feel ashamed and lonely and fundamentally like a loser. Bowler says that since getting sick, she has come to embrace the idea of precarity, the precarity of life. Precarity is the idea that things are contingent, they're delicate, they aren't always sure. Bowler says she has latched onto the word precarity because it means I don't have to pretend that things were once durable and that I'm supposed to, as a suffering person, get back to durability. Our lives are built with such delicate material, she says. It doesn't take a whole lot to topple the whole thing over. Naomi and Ruth and Orpah knew that too well. And they didn't try to look on the bright side. They didn't try to cheer each other up. They just wept and held on to each other as best they could. We don't hear more of Orpah's story, but we do know, or we can know if we will read to the end of this book, that For Ruth and Naomi, the story ends well. A good man marries Ruth and gives both Ruth and Naomi safety in his home. Ruth becomes pregnant and has a healthy baby boy. Naomi hugs this child to her chest, and the whole neighborhood celebrates her gladness. This baby becomes the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David, Israel's greatest king. Who'd have thought? It's all understood to be the work and the will of God. So if you and I had been there, knowing what we know, we might have wanted to say, hang in there, ladies. God loves you and has a plan for you. Tomorrow will be better. But not even the all-knowing narrator does that here in the midst of these women's grief. The story is patient. The narrator is restrained. The women are left to feel what they feel, and their grief does its mysterious work. Part of what I appreciate about this story is the way that it begins so unassumingly. So far, other books of the Bible have started dramatically, with God beginning to create the heavens and the earth, or as the Israelites came into Egypt with households that were fertile and became prosperous, or with the Lord calling to Moses from the meeting tent and Moses addressing all the Israelites, with Joshua leading God's people across the Jordan into the promised land. It's very obvious in those stories. Big things are afoot. This story starts with a few people whose lives have unraveled, who are desperate, who fear they have nothing left to live for. They command our attention only because the narrator knows they deserve our attention. The narrator knows that sometimes God is most powerfully at work when we are least inclined to believe it.